President Trump held back from immediate imposing new tariffs on Canada and Mexico in his first day in office, but the president said he would add an additional 10% tariff on Chinese products. Now, have the stock market and businesses responded? And what are the costs and benefits of taxes versus tariffs? Joining me now to assess these developments is Doug Flynn, partner and co-founder of Flynn Zito Capital Management. President Trump holding back from immediately opposing those new tariffs on his first day in office, but just last night the president says he would add an additional 10% tariff onto Chinese products. This because China is sending fentanyl into Mexico and Canada, which eventually makes its way into the United States. How are businesses and investors responding to this?
Well, initially they responded pretty well from the standpoint of everyone seemed to think that the tariffs were going to go in on day one. And so there was a little bit of a relief rally yesterday and into today about the fact that maybe that's going to get pushed off a little bit. So maybe it's not going to be quite as harsh as they all thought it was going to be. But the fact of the matter remains that it's just being pushed out a little bit to February. So it still might have the same impact longer term, but it's just maybe not as harsh in the near term right now. It's a big push to try to keep both the migrants as well as the drugs out, and so putting these in as a negotiating tactic to try to get a better deal for the U.S., I think, is where this is going.
There's also talk about tariffs on Mexico and Canada as well. If you could, talk to us about some examples of how the American supply chain is tied in and integrated with Mexico and Canada, and how could tariffs impact this relationship?
Yeah, it's really interesting. On both fronts, Canada has about 77% of its exports to the U.S., and Mexico has 80% of its exports to the U.S. So we're their biggest trading partner, and vice versa, they're ours. But it can impact them almost more than it impacts us, because we're such a large trading partner to each of them. And so while I think every time there's a positive, there could be an offsetting negative, and that's where the uncertainty comes in. You don't know exactly which things are going to get the tariffs. Right now, there's talk about blanket tariffs overall, but it might come out that it's more targeted. There might be these products it's going to stay on, these products are going to be excluded. So we don't have all the details, and so that's what creates a little bit of the uncertainty. But they have to be very careful, the other countries, because in as much as we don't really want this, they certainly don't want it either, which I think is what gets to the heart of it, is how do we negotiate something that's more fair for both of us?
Talk to us about the nature of taxes that could go up on a personal level versus finding that money somewhere else vis-a-vis tariffs, and which one do you think is actually the better path?
So if you look back to the Trump 1.0, if you will, while tariffs were implemented, it didn't really have an impact on inflation. Trump had some of the lowest inflation in recent memory during that time where he implemented tariffs. So it's not necessarily that it's going to automatically translate into inflation. Now, based on Biden, how much inflation has gone up over the last couple of years, you hit a point, I think, where those additional tariffs could raise prices on the consumer. There's not much more that maybe the companies can eat. So I think what's really happening is after this, Trump's going to get back to talking about a corporate tax cut. He mentioned bring it down from 21% to 20 or even 15%. And if you get it down to 15%, that's billions of extra dollars that are going to flow to the companies. And I think what happens is if you do have an increase in cost from the tariffs, it can be offset by the tax savings these companies are going to have. We haven't gotten there yet. And admittedly, if they don't get that corporate tax cut, some of those costs are absolutely going to get passed down to the consumer. But we just don't know if it's actually going to happen yet, because they might get an offsetting corporate tax cut, which means that we're not going to have any of these big inflation increases at all, and then the market really can get behind that, which ultimately I think Trump is a big market guy. That's what he really wants, to have a really successful stock market as well.
Is it fair to say that the tariff could be more fleeting than, say, some other form of tax that is more long-lasting and permanent?
Well, that's interesting. In the past, I would say yes, and you can even look up how Trump handled the China tariffs in 1.0. And what happened is we came out with something and they retaliated. And if you follow along, it was back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And they could put tariffs on and take them off and lower them. That happens much more quickly and much more easily than a tax that we have to have everybody vote on and change, and it might be years before we can change it again. So I think you do get a little bit more flexibility in the tariffs, and basically there's going to be a little bit of this, and hopefully it doesn't turn into an all-out trade war. Nobody wants that. But I think you can go back and forth and then ultimately settle on something and then lower them later on as needed.
You know, more importantly, when you look at tariffs as a negotiating tool, do you think that they could serve the purpose of bringing, say, China, Mexico, and Canada to the negotiating table with China when it comes to the stopping the flow of fentanyl and also illegal immigrants in Mexico into the United States?
Definitely. I think that's the whole point of this, is it's not just about the short term of impacting the flow of migrants and drugs. Obviously, we want to cut that down in this administration, but also it's about getting a better deal for the U.S. A lot of these deals were put in place decades ago, and they're not as fair as they could be at the end of the day. So maybe get a little bit of a better deal. We might not get 100% of what we want, but it's probably going to be a better deal. And the real long view, if you're thinking beyond Trump and you're thinking decades down the road, if you get a lot more onshoring or reshoring of jobs, and it might cost a little bit more in the short run, but in the long run, from a national security standpoint, that's a much better way to go. I think he's willing to take a little bit of short-term pain to get a little bit of a better long-term deal overall. So I think there's short-term benefits, but there could really be some serious long-term benefits for this country and the people of it. And then, you know, they'll still do okay in the other parts of the world as well. But it's about his whole premise here of getting a better deal for the people of the U.S.
Doug, lastly, China, a communist regime, the largest one on the planet, obviously the largest adversary to the United States, while Canada and Mexico are close trading partners, both of which some might consider close allies. How could each, at least Canada for that matter, how could each of these countries respond to these tariffs?
They're going to do a lot of, blustering and saying, we're going to, retaliate. And they need to say that and save face for their people, all the elected officials. I think that will happen in both Canada and Mexico, but it will really happen in China because they're all about how it looks to their people. So I think that's all, how it's going to be put out there. But behind that, in the negotiating table, we're going to get a better deal. I think at the end of the day, that's what's going to happen. But how they're going to put it out to their people everywhere in all these different countries might not be as clear as it's going to be over here, and that's okay. In the end, I think if we do get a better deal, however they have to sell it to their people is fine. Trump, I'm sure, is going to sell it to us in the highest possible way that he typically does, the way he speaks.
Doug Flynn, really appreciate your perspective. Thank you.
Anytime. Thanks.